Welcome to today's weekly recap, where we discuss some of the top stories of the past week. Let's get right into it. So earlier this week, President Trump had announced Project Freedom, which was a plan to get commercial tankers from U.S. ships and allied ships through the Strait of Hormuz. However, Iranian forces went on the offensive to deter this project, and unfortunately, a day and a half after this project was started, it was put on pause. So this gives kind of an insight into no one really having control, or Iran essentially having the control over who operates within that jurisdiction. The good thing is, which I guess I should digress before I say the good things, but following those strikes, the U.S. Navy struck force on fortunately empty Iranian oil tankers in order to try to get around the blockade. However, I don't believe this was affected, and President Trump has claimed this ceasefire will be back in effect. However, it seems very wishy-washy of when the governments are choosing to honor the ceasefire and not. So at the moment, it doesn't really seem like we can trust the word of either party. And I believe this was a while back, but President Trump also suggested imposing a 10% tariff on all goods, which was recently ruled against by the Federal Trade Court. So this will give allies a little more certainty and cooperation to continue doing business with the U.S. However, it does seem like most governments are trying to do as much internally as they can and rely less upon outside forces, which we'll talk about a specific case on that later. So probably 2 months ago, our Department of War and Anthropic had a public dispute regarding the autonomy of weapons and essentially who would be responsible for autonomous decisions when it came to war, as well as security for public citizens. And this to me was a little more comedic because obviously you're dealing with the Department of War, who has the jurisdiction on war. So by law, they do not break civil liberties, and other U.S. departments are more compliant with that. But I do think the philosophy of responsibility and having decision makers and less autonomy within weapons of war is a good practice. However, I don't think the specific use case for that product would have been affected. So this was more of a PR stunt, in my opinion. Now, given that context, the Department of War has shopped around since that because they considered Anthropic a risk to national security. So now I believe there are 9 companies that have elected to do deals with the Department of War. And obviously most of these are your standard headline companies within the AI and software industry. So the only real implication I see of this at the moment is that the short-term stock prices of each of these companies will likely spike. That being said, I've already mentioned a majority of these companies being mainstream, with the one exception being Reflection AI. However, that's not a publicly tradable company. So other than long-term investments, I don't think there's arbitrage here. Going back to Anthropic, some of the recent developments they've been doing is joint ventures and forming partnerships with Wall Street. So firms like Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, upon others. And the goal with this is to essentially utilize their AI tools and products and the professional expertise of these Wall Street firms to create better consulting projects for probably bulge bracket firms or middle market PE firms. And I will say I'm quite surprised at the investment amount being around $300 million. That seems like a lot for these partnerships. However, I'm sure the rewards of these deals are going to be massive. So what I think they'd plan on doing is first consulting and creating a tool or a product that will serve these smaller funds. And eventually, I think that joint venture will spin out into its own software. Another Anthropic story. Essentially, it seems like Elon and SpaceX have realized that their XAI tool and Grok have not been training on the data that they probably should be to make the most effective product. And companies like Cursor and Anthropic have more of an advantage in that space. So Elon seems to now be renting out his Colossus supercomputer to companies like Cursor for the Colossus 2, which holds about 4 to 5 times the compute as Colossus 1 did. And this partnership with Anthropic for their Colossus 1 supercomputer is about 3/4 of the megawatt usage of that supercomputer. So that really gives you a scale of how much XAI and Grok have been kind of put on the back burner for Elon, and it seems like he's a lot more willing to do partnerships to get the most effective product out there. And when we look at the deal details, you can see here that a few million each year will be added to SpaceX's revenue, which really helps them because right now, for the goals that Elon has, they're very cash constrained, which is ironic to think with him being the wealthiest man on paper to date. However, I think he's starting to realize, as I mentioned before, that partnership and collaboration needs to happen for these tools to be used most effectively. Now, China's AI labs, for the most part, have been on the heels of OpenAI and America's technologies, and they've pretty much open sourced products. I also saw an article recently that mentioned China has started to cut off outside investment into their AI ecosystem. So whether it be the semiconductors or the LLMs themselves, as I mentioned earlier, this is where it comes to the importance of developing things in-house and internally and having the domestic capacity to do so, because China has been doing that for years, where they have government money that's sponsoring a lot of the innovation and development, but they're pretty liberal with who they sponsor. So it's not like they're funneling all the funds into one or two companies, but eventually those companies aggregate into the competitive leaders of the landscape, which I think this approach has been more effective than what we've seen. However, we still have the claim on talent, and so long as talent is able to leave China, I believe we have them in a foothold there. OpenAI released new voice models for transcription and translation. And why is this very useful? Every model should essentially have voice transcription and proper reasoning with voice inflectuations, because eventually that's where the LLMs and AI needs to go. The reason for that is that people speak 2 to 3 times faster than what they typically type. So eventually, whether we're talking to a computer or a physical robot, there needs to be real-time translation and reasoning. Now, this is something you might want to check into. So a group of agencies from the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada published an article on what they believe should be the approach to corporate engagement with agentic AI. So in this article, it focuses a lot on cybersecurity and infrastructure, with the hope that individuals within corporate are sufficiently safeguarding their usage of agentic AI. And if that's something you'd like to check out, I'll link the full PDF in the description. This has also been months in the making. So New York City is planning a Pied-à-Terre tax on properties that are listed 5 million or more. And essentially what this is Mayor Mondami has realized there are a lot of billionaires, a lot of wealthy individuals that have multiple properties throughout the US and secondary residences that they don't reside in. And so the objective with this tax is to essentially create a burden on the wealthy individuals who hold that real estate to add more monies to the communal fund. On the surface, this might seem like a good idea, and for working class individuals, it could reduce the tax burden. However, in practice, we've already seen with California's proposed one-time tax on billionaires, what's most likely to happen when jurisdictions implement a tax like this, a lot of these executives will start liquidating their assets or moving their companies to completely different states like Texas, Florida, or Wyoming, where there's no state income taxes, and this behavior is a lot less likely. Now, the meme of the week was GameStop. The CEO of GameStop essentially had very few words for the inquisition of how they would acquire eBay, who is currently valued more than they are. So here's your GameStop meme for the week.
I hear you. I understand that. I'm just trying to understand where the rest of the money would come from.
It's half cash, half stock.
I hear you. I'm just saying that math doesn't get you to the price that you're offering.
So, that's a pretty straightforward question. I don't get it. Like, where's the rest of the money coming from? Andrew laid it out pretty clearly.
I don't understand your question. We're offering half cash, half stock.
And wrapping things up real quick, consumer sentiment hit an all-time low. Gas prices in the last week are up 7.5 cents. National average at $4.52. On the bright side, last month was the first time in the past year that we've had 2 consecutive months where employment has increased. So fingers crossed that there's a stabilization in the job market. That's all for this week's recap. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Until next time.